guys, so I am here today, middle of December, roundabout, to share with you my most anticipated book releases for 2020. So I regularly keep a note of books I am looking forward to coming out, I want to keep an eye on, to potentially pick up or request for publishers from review as the year goes on, and I have quite a few on my list that are being released in the coming year. I'm sure more will end up being announced that I haven't heard of at the moment and that I will want to pick up as the year goes on, but these are the ones that are currently high up on my radar and I wanted to share with you guys in case you were interested in what I was looking forward to coming out next year and that you might be interested in looking out for next year. But let's just jump straight in. These books are in no particular order. I will give you the release date according to UK Amazon. That may be subject to change, but that's the information that I'm going off at the moment. So let's start with Good Girl, Bad Blood by Holly Jackson. It is a sequel to a young adult thriller called A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, which I read this year and thoroughly enjoyed. I actually interviewed the author for my channel, so I'll link that interview down below in case you're interested and haven't yet read book one. But I'm a big fan of the young adult thriller genre. I think these stakes are at a level that I prefer necessarily to adult thrillers, and there's often other themes going on apart from the kind of like terrifying crime side of things, but at the same time they're intriguing and fast-paced and fun, and I've always just very much enjoyed them, and I really enjoyed A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. So in that book, our main character Pip, for a school project, undertook essentially solving a crime that had happened in the past in her little town, and now that she's learned she has a bit of a eye for sleuthing, she is on it again. Someone else in her town has gone missing, and since the police don't seem willing to look for them, she decides to take matters into her own hands because she obviously believes that something, you know, more sinister is afoot than apparently the rest of the community are under the impression of. Very much enjoyed book one. I'm really looking forward to book two, and this one comes out on the 30th of April 2020 in the UK. Whilst we're talking about sequels, let me mention A Heart So Fierce and Broken by Bridget Kemmerer. This is the sequel to A Curse So Dark and Lonely, which was a Beauty and the Beast retelling set between our modern world and a parallel fantasy world, and following a main character who has cerebral palsy. I read this quite recently and really enjoyed it, so immediately knew I would be reading book two. I myself am lucky enough to have a proof already, but the final copy comes out on the 7th of January 2020, which isn't too long to wait, at least for those of you who are equally as excited as I am. And from what I gather, this one follows a lead character who is a side character in book one, so that is the character of Grey, who is the prince's personal guard or manservant in book one, and given events at the end of book one, it's kind of time for his story to be told, and it also expands on the world of book one and the interactions between different kingdoms and different royal families. So I'm really looking forward to returning to this world. I'm particularly looking forward to returning to our protagonist Harper from book one, even if this book isn't focused on her, because she's one of my favourite protagonists that I read about in 2019, and even just a little bit of her will be a great thing, and I did enjoy Grey, so I will be excited to learn more about his story. Continuing with the sequels, next is Hollowpox, which is actually book 3 in a series. It's book 3 in Jessica Townsend's The Trials of Morgan Crow series, which began with Nevermore. I read Nevermore over a year ago and then recently read the sequel Wondersmith and loved it as much as book one. This is a middle grade fantasy series that is just excellent for all ages. It's one of those middle grade fantasy series I think very much adults can enjoy. I mean, I did, but I think that goes for a lot of adults as well, not just me. And I am just so eagerly anticipating what is next in the adventures of Morgan Crow, who was meant to die on her 11th birthday because of a curse, but is instead whisked away to the world of Nevermore, where she has to take part in these trials to get into the Wondrous Society, and we're now following her adventures in Nevermore. Obviously I can't give more away than that because this is book 3 in the series, but yes, I will be picking this one up immediately and reading it immediately. Unfortunately though, it doesn't come out until August 18th 2020, but it will be worth the wait. Just so everything's not a sequel, next I'm going to mention Belle Revolt by Lindsay Miller. Now I have mentioned this recently because I actually was sent a proof copy of this one. It comes out on the 1st of March 2020 in the UK, so I'll probably read it before then and I'll I'll let you know my thoughts then. But I think it sounds amazing, and it's definitely one that I think you should keep an eye out for in 2020, because it is a queer fantasy novel with a female-female romance, which is basically everything I look for in a book. Just like tick, tick, tick. We followed two girls from different backgrounds, one from a royal background, one from just like a more lower class ordinary background, and they decide to switch places because they want different things from life, and being in each other's place will give them the opportunity to do those things. However, they then need to join together to save the world, because it's a fantasy book and that's what happens in fantasy books. But on top of the, like I mentioned already, female-female romance in this one, I also believe there is asexual representation in this book, and potentially other representation for the LGBTQ+ spectrum. I will discover that when I read it for myself, so I'm really excited to dive into this one. Continuing on the queer theme is a book that I do, again, have a review copy of. This one I got from NetCali, so I have a version of on my Kindle, but that is The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood, which comes out on the 20th of February 2020, so not quite as long for this one. And what immediately drew me to this is not only is it a queer female-female fantasy romance, but the two lead characters, or the two women in this relationship, are orcs, which I think is such a cool concept, kind of turning on its head the quintessential bad guy characters from traditional fantasy and giving them more complex characterization. I really enjoy that, so I'm looking forward to just kind of seeing what this author does. I think it sounds like a unique fantasy concept, and that was enough to draw me to it and get me excited for it. We then have one that I don't think there's a cover for yet, and actually I might have mentioned in a previous anticipated releases video, because I think originally it was meant to come out in 2019, but you know, these things happen. Publishing houses or authors need a little bit more time, and books sometimes get delayed, and now it's coming on the 3rd of September 2020, and that is The Alternative and How We Build It by Owen Jones. Owen Jones is one of my favourite non-fiction writers. He is a UK-based journalist with two previous books called The Establishment and Chavs. Chavs is literally one of my favourite books of all time. It's one of the best non-fiction books, if not just books, I've ever read. I think it's brilliant. And I would, read anything basically that Owen Jones reads. I really like his approach to non-fiction writing. I think it's very accessible, but very well researched and in-depth, and in no way lacking for information despite being accessible. And this one actually sounds a little bit more positive than I think a lot of non-fiction books can be, because rather than simply pointing out the flaws in our society, which I think is incredibly important and we should read about that, it's also suggesting how we can improve our society in practical measures, the kind of society we should strive to have and changes we need to make, and finding a system that is fair and equal for all. So that's something I would love to read about his take on, and I'm just super eager to read this one. Another one that doesn't have a cover because it's also not out till the 3rd of September 2020, but is like really high up there on this list. Like, this is near the top, and that is The Bride Bet by Tessa Dare. If you've watched a few of my videos in 2019, you've probably noticed that Tessa Dare quickly became one of my favourite authors. She is a historical romance writer who writes romance novels with awesome female leads set in the 1800s. And The Bride Bet is part of a quartet of novels, each of which follows a different friend in this friendship group living in 1800s England. And in each book we follow a different one of these friends falling in love in their own unique way, because they're such a excellent group of characters. They're all endearing, but they all find their strength from different places. They all have different interests, yet they manage to support one another, and I love their friendship dynamic as part of the books as well. And this is the 4th and final Friends love story, and I'm so excited about it because it was hinted at the end of book 3, I think it was, and I need to know the backstory there, because if you've read it you'll know exactly what I mean. So cannot wait for that. We then have another romance sequel, but this one's fantasy romance, and that is Blood and Honey by Shelby Mahurin, which I don't think has a release date yet, but I'm pretty sure is meant to come out in 2020, so fingers crossed, because this is a sequel to Serpent and Dove, which I read very recently and really want the sequel for. I want to know what's next on the cards for these two characters, but it is set in a kind of faux French historical setting where witch hunts are a massive part of society. They're organised by the church because witches are very real in this world, and sure, some witches do evil things, but but most of them are just like ordinary folk like everybody else. They just have a bit of magic, and equally lots of women who aren't witches end up getting accused of witchcraft. So, you know, quintessential like patriarchy and misogyny and sexism and witch hunts against women in a historical society. Not that surprising, but excellently done. And we follow the accidental marriage of one of these witch hunters to one of these witches and their hate to love romance, and it's brilliant, and I need to know the rest of their story. We then have a contemporary romance. Yes, not something I read as much of, but I'm dipping my toes into of late, and this is one I've heard incredible things about because as far as I'm aware it's already out in the US, but the UK release date is the 14th of May 2020, and that is The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. Basically every US based booktuber I follow that reads romance has read this book and raved about it, and I've been wanting it for ages, but it's not been out in the UK. It's another hate to love where we follow a brother and a sister to a bride and groom. So the bride and groom have got married, and their respective brothers and sister are the only two people not to get food poisoning at their wedding, so decide to go on their siblings' honeymoon, if that makes sense. I don't know if I explained that perfectly. But they go on this honeymoon despite not really liking each other, just figuring they can have their own like holiday for free and ignore the other one. But of course they fall in love because it's a romance novel. That would be a slightly strange setup if that's not what was going to happen. And basically I've just heard great reviews of this, so I'm very intrigued to give it a shot. And then next we actually have another young adult thriller sequel, which is One of Us Is Next by Karen M. McManus, the sequel to One of Us Is Lying. Thankfully I don't have long to wait for this. It comes out on the 9th of January 2020, but like I mentioned before, I really enjoy a young adult thriller, and Karen M. McManus is very much one of the authors that got me into this genre or got me hooked on this genre. I've really enjoyed her previous two young adult thrillers, one of which, like I mentioned, is the book that comes before this book in this series. The other one was a standalone. And this one returns to the same high school of One of Us Is Lying, where a new game has kind of taken the campus by storm, a very dangerous version of Truth or Dare that I think ends up resulting in a death or something more sinister happening, and the kids kind of have to figure out who is behind this game and kind of leading their peers into danger. Like I mentioned, purely going on the basis that I loved her other two books, and I'm really excited to see what she has in store next. Then I do have one more sequel in a series I'm not entirely up to date with, but I will be before it comes out, and that is The King of Crows, book 4 in the Diviner series by Libba Bray. I'm actually currently in the process of reading book 2, so not quite caught up, but this doesn't come out till the 4th of February 2020, and even then I don't have to read it the date it comes out. So once I finish book 2, I do plan on reading book 3 quite quickly after, so that I'll be ready to read book 4 and the final book in the series along with everyone else, and kind of find out how this series culminates and what is in store for all of our well-beloved characters. I know this is a lot of people's favourite series and they are so excited for this release, so I could not mention it here even though I'm not up to date. But if you're not aware, the Diviner series is a 1920s young adult paranormal historical novel. I think I kind of covered all the adjectives there, where we follow a group of different characters as multiple perspective, each of whom live in New York and have their own special gifts and are gradually being drawn together as a group to face darker evils in their society that kind of only they can defeat. But one of my favourite things about Libba Bray's books in general are her historical settings. She writes such detailed, lengthy young adult fantasy or paranormal mystery that I absolutely adore. Like, I love the level of detail and depth in her historical settings that I think she does them so well, and she writes really like complex, well constructed characters. And yeah, I just couldn't not mention The King of Crows. We then have Witches of Ash and Ruin by E. Latimer. Now, I don't know anything about this book other than what the blurb tells me, but the blurb sounds incredible, so I'm just going to read you the blurb. This one is about 17-year-old Danya Walsh, who is struggling to cope with her somatic OCD, the aftermath of being outed as bisexual in her conservative Irish town, and the return of her long-absent mother who barely seems like a parent. Already loads of themes there that I'm super interested in. But all that really matters to her is ascending and finally becoming a full witch. Plans are complicated when another coven, rumoured to have a sordid history with black magic, arrives in town with premonitions of death. Danya immediately finds herself at odds with the bewitchingly frustrating minor king, the granddaughter of their coven leader. And then a witch turns up murdered at local sacred site, along with the blood symbol of the Butcher of Manchester, an infamous serial killer whose trail has long gone cold. Witchcraft, queer rep, OCD rep, and a bit of a murder mystery in a paranormal fantasy setting? Yes. Tick, tick, tick. Tick, tick. I can't remember how many ticks are needed there, but that sounds amazing and I cannot wait for this book. It comes out on the 3rd of March 2020. Then last, but certainly not least, is Or What You Will by Jo Walton, which comes out on the 7th of July 2020. And I have really enjoyed Jo Walton's books in the past. She writes such a vast variety of fantastical novels. Like, they very much range from like historical to contemporary to high fantasy, but all with a sort of magical element. And she's such a clever writer that I'm always interested in seeing what she has coming out, and thought that this new book by her sounded particularly interesting. And this was actually about a fantasy writer who writes YA fantasy and is now in her 70s, but throughout all of her books there's sort of been this presence which is called he in the blurb, that has been with her through all of her writing, and he has taken many different forms in all of her books, but it's always been a version of him, and he's kind of taken on his own life, or perhaps he was always his own creature, just sort of trapped within her body and escaping through her novels. And now that she is getting older, he is trying to find a way to break free of the confines of this woman and her writing and get into the real world. At least that's what I gather from the blurb. It sounds very surreal. It's a book about books, which is always something I'm interested in checking out, and like I mentioned, I've just very much enjoyed Jo Walton's writing in the past, so I'd like to see what she does with this slightly strange but intriguing plot. But those are the books highest on my radar, the ones I am 100% going to be checking out in some form or another in 2020. I've certainly seen a few other books that I might be interested in, but I decided to keep this video at a manageable amount. I would still love to hear from you though, if you have more recommendations, books you're excited about coming out in 2020, books you'd love to hear my thoughts on. Leave them in the comments down below, and until next time, happy reading. I'll see you again soon. Bye guys!